February 11th, 2026. Uniformed guards carried a glass coffin through a church in Rome with full military honors. Inside the glowing glass coffin was a remarkably lifelike figure, the body of a child who has been dead for more than 120 years. The girl appears to be asleep, not dead for over a century. To Italians, she is a hero. To Catholics, she is a martyr and a saint, and she is at the center of one of the most remarkable stories of forgiveness ever recorded. Her name was Saint Maria Goretti. She was killed in Italy in 1902 at just 11 years old after resisting a violent attack inside her family's farmhouse. But this story isn't simply about a murder. What happened while she was dying would transform her into one of the most famous saints of the modern era. Before breathing her last breath, Maria Goretti uttered words that would set into motion one of the most extraordinary stories in history. Long before she became one of the most famous child saints in the world, Saint Maria Goretti was simply a poor girl growing up in the Italian countryside. She was born in 1890 in the town of Corinaldo, Italy, into a struggling farming family with very little money and few opportunities. Her father worked as a laborer, moving from property to property, searching for work wherever he could find it. Eventually, the family relocated to the marshy farmland south of Rome near Nettuno, a region notorious at the time for disease, poverty, and brutal living conditions. The Gorettis did not own land themselves. Instead, Maria's father entered into a sharecropping arrangement with a wealthy landowner. In exchange for farming the property, the family was allowed to live in a crude abandoned structure on the estate while turning over most of the harvest to the owner. Life was hard, but for a short time the arrangement worked. Then disaster struck. Maria's father contracted malaria, a deadly disease that plagued much of the rural Italy at the time, and died within days, leaving behind a widow and 6 children. The loss devastated the family financially. Maria's mother suddenly faced an impossible situation: somehow maintain exhausting agricultural labor while also caring for 5 young children alone. So the responsibilities of the household quietly fell onto Maria. At just 10 years old, she became the one cooking meals and cleaning the home and caring for her siblings, sewing and helping hold the family together while her mother worked long hours in the fields. People who knew Maria later described her as unusually mature for her age. Quiet, deeply religious, obedient, and intensely protective of her family. But during the same period, another presence was beginning to loom over the Goretti household. A 20-year-old laborer named Alessandro Serenelli. He lived nearby and worked alongside the families on the property. At first, his behavior toward Maria seemed merely crude and inappropriate. Vulgar comments, disturbing attention, and lingering stares. But over time, the situation became darker. Alessandro began making explicit advances toward the young girl and eventually threatened violence if she refused him. Maria found herself trapped. There was no father in the house to protect her. Her exhausted mother depended heavily on the fragile living arrangement keeping the family alive, and Alessandro had carefully positioned himself as someone helpful and trustworthy around the farm. Maria understood that if she revealed everything, the family could lose their home entirely. So she stayed silent. And that silence would lead to one of the most shocking crimes in modern Catholic history. By the summer of 1902, the situation inside the farmhouse had become dangerous. Maria Goretti was now living under constant tension from Alessandro Serenelli, the older laborer who had become increasingly obsessed with her. According to later testimony, Alessandro had spent months harassing Maria with threats and explicit demands. He wanted her to submit to him. He made it clear he was willing to use violence if she refused. Maria repeatedly resisted him, but the circumstances around her made escape almost impossible. Her mother worked long, exhausting days in the fields. The families lived in near isolation. and Alessandro knew exactly when Maria would sometimes be left alone in the house, caring for her younger siblings. Then, on July 5th, 1902, the moment finally came. Maria was alone inside the farmhouse sewing when Alessandro entered. What happened next would horrify Italy. According to the historical accounts, Alessandro grabbed Maria and attempted to force himself on her. But Maria fought back fiercely. Witnesses later reported that she screamed at him to stop, warning him that what he was doing was a grave sin before God. The resistance enraged him. Alessandro pulled out a sharpened metal file, a farming tool that had been ground into a weapon, and attacked her. He stabbed the 11-year-old girl over and over again. The wounds were catastrophic. Some reportedly pierced through her body. Others struck her spine with such force that the weapon itself bent during the attack. Maria collapsed onto the floor, bleeding heavily, while Alessandro fled the room, believing she was already dead. But she was still alive. In unimaginable pain, the little girl regained consciousness and began dragging herself across the farmhouse floor toward the door, trying desperately to unlock it and call for help. Then Alessandro heard her, and he returned and stabbed her again. This second attack would prove fatal. By the time neighbors finally discovered Maria, severe internal infection had already begun spreading through her body. She was rushed to a hospital many miles away, barely alive. Doctors immediately realized the injuries were likely impossible to survive. But what happened during Maria Goretti's final hours would be the reason the world remembers her. When Maria arrived at the hospital, doctors immediately understood how severe the injuries were. The stabbing had caused massive internal damage. Her intestines had been perforated, allowing infection to spread rapidly through her abdomen, a condition known as peritonitis that was almost always fatal in the early 1900s. She had also lost an enormous amount of blood. As the fever began rising through her body, Maria repeatedly begged for water, but the doctors refused. Anything she swallowed could leak through the intestinal wounds and worsen the infection they were desperately trying to stop. For an 11-year-old child already suffering catastrophic injuries, the thirst became agonizing. At one point, a priest standing beside her hospital bed reminded Maria that Christ himself had also asked for water while dying on the cross. According to accounts, Maria quietly offered up her suffering. Then came the surgery. Doctors attempted an emergency operation to repair the internal damage. But Maria had become so weak from blood loss that they feared anesthesia itself could kill her. So the surgeons proceeded without it. During the operation, they enlarged the stab wounds in order to reach the damaged organs and attempt internal repairs. Maria remained conscious. Witnesses later claimed that despite the pain, she didn't scream or lash out during the procedure. But the surgery failed. The infection continued spreading through her body, and it became clear she would not survive the night. Then came the moment that would define her legacy forever. As Maria lay dying, she was asked about Alessandro Serenelli, the man who had attacked her and murdered her. Her response stunned everyone around her. "I forgive him." According to multiple accounts, Maria went even further. She said she wanted Alessandro to be with her someday in heaven. Within hours, the 11-year-old girl was dead. News of the murder quickly spread throughout Italy, but over time, it would not be remembered simply as a brutal crime. It would become known as one of the most extraordinary stories of forgiveness in modern Catholic history. After the murder, Alessandro Serenelli was arrested and placed on trial. At first, he showed little remorse. According to reports from the time, Alessandro blamed Maria herself for what had happened, insisting that if she had simply obeyed him, none of it would have occurred. The court couldn't believe him. He was convicted and sentenced to decades in prison. But prison didn't immediately change him. Accounts from the period describe Alessandro as violent, unstable, and consumed with rage. He fought with other inmates repeatedly and eventually spent long stretches isolated from the rest of the prison population because authorities considered him too dangerous. Years passed. Then something strange allegedly happened. According to Alessandro's later testimony, one night he experienced a vivid dream or vision involving Maria Goretti. He claimed he saw her standing in a garden holding white lilies, symbols often associated with purity and innocence. One by one, she handed the flowers to him. There were 14 lilies, the same number as the stab wounds inflicted during her attack. Whether viewed as a religious experience, psychological collapse, or a profound moment of guilt, Alessandro later described the event as completely transforming for him. For the first time since the murder, he reportedly broke down emotionally and admitted full responsibility for what he had done. He asked for a priest. He confessed. And over time, fellow prisoners began noticing dramatic changes in his behavior. The violent man who had entered prison slowly became quiet, disciplined, and deeply religious. But perhaps the most astonishing moment came years later, after his release. Alessandro sought out Maria's mother. By then, nearly everything in her life had been shattered by the murder of her daughter. In the aftermath of Maria's death, poverty and desperation had forced her to give away her remaining children because she could no longer care for them alone. Then one day, decades after the attack, there was a knock at her door. Standing outside was the man who had murdered her little girl. Alessandro asked her a simple question: "Can you forgive me?" Her response became almost as famous as Maria's own final words: "If Maria forgave you, how can I refuse?" The two later attended Christmas Mass together and received communion side by side. For many Catholics, that moment became the ultimate conclusion to Maria Goretti's story. Not simply the murderer of a child, but the transformation of hatred into forgiveness, and forgiveness into redemption. As the years passed, the story of Maria Goretti spread far beyond rural Italy. What began as a horrifying murder gradually transformed into one of the most powerful Catholic stories of the 20th century. Pilgrims became fascinated not only by Maria herself, but by the extraordinary chain of events her forgiveness appeared to unleash. The conversion of her killer, the reconciliation with her mother, and reports of prayers and miracles associated with her name. Devotion to Maria Goretti exploded across Italy. Prayer cards bearing her image circulated by the tens of thousands. Churches began honoring her publicly, and before long, the Vatican opened the process that would eventually declare the murdered 11-year-old girl a saint. Then came one of the most remarkable canonization ceremonies in Catholic history. On June 24, 1950, more than 500,000 people flooded into Rome for Maria Goretti's canonization by Pope Pius XII. The crowds were so enormous that St. Peter's Basilica could not contain them. For the first time in history, a canonization ceremony had to be held outside in St. Peter's Square because the church itself was too small. And standing among the massive crowd that day was Maria's own mother. It was the first known time in Catholic history that a saint's parent attended their child's canonization. Even more astonishing, also present that day was Alessandro Serenelli, the murderer. The same man who had once stabbed an 11-year-old girl to death inside a farmhouse now stood among the faithful as the church proclaimed her a saint. In the decades that followed, Maria Goretti became one of the most recognizable Catholic figures of the modern era. Today, her remains are preserved at the sanctuary of St. Maria Goretti, where pilgrims continue lining up to see the haunting figure resting inside the glass coffin. The body visible today is covered by a remarkably lifelike wax effigy constructed over her relics, giving the appearance of a sleeping child, peacefully at rest despite having been dead for more than 120 years. To believers, she became far more than a victim. She became a symbol of purity, a martyr, a national religious hero in Italy, and for many Catholics, living proof that forgiveness can transform even the darkest acts of violence into something radically unexpected. Because in the end, the story of Maria Goretti was never only about the way she died. It was about what happened after she chose to forgive. This has become for me one of the most difficult stories to tell, and I'd like to know what you think in the comments. Please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more stories like this, please subscribe to the channel.